Chapter we're going to look at time series graphics. This is one of my favorite chapters to teach. It's sort of introductory, but it really is very fundamental to our understanding of time series econometrics. Now, why do we want to plot the data and look at graphics? There is a lot of usefulness in plotting the data or looking at anything visually. First, you're able to identify patterns over time. You're able to identify any type of outlying observations. You can also look at changes over time, whether it relates to trends increasing or decreasing over time. And what is more interesting as time series econometricians is to look at the relationship between two or more variables over time. So is it positive, is it negative, and can one help predict the other, or can many other time series predict one variable? That's where we want to go. So the idea behind studying time series graphics is that if you spot any features that you see are important, we want to try to do the best, we want to make the best effort to incorporate those features into our time series models. Okay, so just as a friendly reminder, it's a good idea to review some of your tidyverse functions in R, because we will be using a lot of those. So here's the outline. We're going to be looking at many different time series in R. In particular, we will be looking at time series in the tidyverse space, and we will be looking at two different data sets. We'll look at many different data sets, but in particular, we will look at the Australian prison population and the Australian pharmaceutical sales. We will look at I guess delve a little deeper and look at seasonal plots and understand the differences between seasonal patterns or cyclic patterns. And finally, we'll be looking at lag plots and autocorrelation, which you studied before, but we will look at this from a more applied perspective now in R, and look at white noise processes, which really are the fundamental blocks of any time series. So let's take a look at time series in R first. And here in this slide, what you see is that we're talking about TS-able objects. By now, if you are familiar with the tidyverse, you know that Tibble objects are just data frames in the tidyverse space. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to merge those tibbles or manipulate those tibbles into time series tibbles. So in other words, we want to make them TS-ables, and there are ways to do that, and we'll see that in a little bit. But just before we start, if you ever want to replicate anything on the slides, it's a good idea to first install the FPP3 package from your textbook, and that you can do in RStudio, and then you can always load that in the library, and it loads the tidyverse, it loads a bunch of preloaded data sets that we will work with and make our lives easier. So let's take a look at this global underscore economy data set that's available in the FPP3 package. So what you want to do is you can first watch these videos, or you can work on RStudio side by side. If you can work on two screens together, that's great. Otherwise, you can do split screen, and you can pause the video anytime and see if it makes sense what I'm saying. Okay, so let's take a look at what is this global underscore economy data set telling us. Really, if you just hit return or enter, you're going to be shown a few things here. This is a TS-able, so it's a time series tibble, which has 15,150 rows and 6 columns. And here we see that the data set is, or all the measured variables here are measured annually. so the frequency is yearly or annual. And we are given that there are 263 unique time series in this data set. Okay, so remember that in a tibble, right, which is the data frame you're familiar with, it stores information. But the TS symbol, right, which is storing information on a time series, is going to have this one additional component, which is going to be the index. Okay, the index is going to be the time structure of the data. So in other words, here we are looking at, year-on-year observations or annual observations, and this shows you that if you look at the year column, you have 1960, 1961, 1962. So this column becomes very important for the TS symbol, and that's how it's identified. So it has a temporal structure, and let's take a look at oops. Okay, so the year column, which is our time column, or the column that is giving us our temporal structure, is going to be our index. This is an argument that you will have to specify in TS symbol, and you'll see that very soon. You will also have some keys, and these keys help us identify these 263 time series uniquely. Okay, so this is going to be very important, right? These factors that you have. In this data set, you're not seeing other keys, but you could imagine there being another column here which spells out the continent that a country belongs to, and that could be another identifier for this data set. Okay, so you have that, and then you have all these measured variables on the right, which include GDP for that country in that given year, imports, exports, and the population, right? So for each key, we have measured variables in a temporal or time series structure. So another type of data set that's preloaded is called tourism. This has 24,320 rows and 5 columns. And notice here it says 1Q, which stands for quarterly data. You have different keys that are given to you. The keys are the regions, right, for tourism, and the state. These are all for Australia. So the region, so these are cities, Adelaide, and then this is talking about the state, which is South Australia. And then this is saying, well, for the tourism, what was the purpose? Was it business? Was it personal? And things like that. So purpose is another key. And then you have number of trips, in that year, in that quarter, for that year, in that quarter, for Adelaide, in South Australia, the number of business trips were 135. So this is the way to read it. And take a look here. The difference between our previous data set and this data set is the frequency, which is quarterly. The number of time series is a little bit more here. And then we have many more keys this time. So earlier we only had country, right, in that global_economy data set. Now in the tourism data set, we have these keys that uniquely identify the time series of interest. Okay, and then you have the trips, number of trips, that is just our measured variable. So what this is measuring is the domestic visitor nights in thousands by state, region, and purpose in Australia. So interesting. So just to recap on what we've covered so far, A TSable object allows us to store and manipulate multiple time series in R. It's very useful because it works with the tidyverse really seamlessly. It always contains an index, which is going to give us the temporal or the time information about the observation of interest. And it's going to have a bunch of measured variables. These are the numbers of interest that we are interested in. And there's going to be key variables that are going to be unique identifiers for each of those series. Okay.